The moment I opened my eyes, the silence of the forest was suffocating. A heavy, unnatural quiet hung in the air, swallowing every rustle of leaves and distant chirp of wild life. I sat upright in my sleeping bag, my breath caught in my chest as I scanned the camp. Something was wrong. No one else was stirring. The faint light of the dying fire cast long, jagged shadows across the clearing, flickering weakly against the dark expanse of trees that loomed on every side. I turned toward Marcus's tent, expecting to hear his familiar snoring, but there was nothing. The flap of his tent hung open, swaying gently in the cold breeze. Marcus, my voice felt small, swallowed by the void. There was no reply. I climbed out of the tent, my feet crunching against the brittle forest floor. The fire pit had been doused, but the charred wood still smoldered faintly. My flashlight barely cut through the thick veil of darkness as I swung it toward Marcus's tent. It was empty. His sleeping bag was rumpled, his backpack untouched, but there was no sign of him. A sharp chill raced down my spine. My gut churned as I took another step forward, the beam of light shaking in my trembling hand. His boots were gone, but his jacket lay crumpled on the ground outside the tent. The forest seemed to close in around me, the once familiar surroundings now foreign and menacing. Then I noticed the carvings. They were etched into the trees surrounding the camp, jagged, looping symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. I hadn't seen them the night before. Illumine del tivole bis ganai. My heart pounded as I moved closer, running my fingers along the rough bark. The grooves were deep, deliberate, as though they'd been cut with something sharp and heavy. The patterns were unlike anything I'd ever seen, twisting and intersecting in ways that made my eyes ache. A sound cut through the silence, a faint, wet rustle like something dragging through leaves. I whipped around, my flashlight darting through the darkness, but the beam revealed nothing. My breath hitched as the sound grew louder, closer, scraping against the fragile threads of my sanity. Marcus? My voice cracked, a hollow whisper, swallowed by the void. I stepped toward the sound, each movement slow and deliberate, every nerve in my body screaming for me to turn back. The air grew colder as I moved, biting against my skin, and the symbols on the trees seemed to glow brighter, their jagged lines twisting and shifting in the flickering light. The noise stopped abruptly, leaving only the deafening silence. My heart thundered in my chest as I swung the flashlight in wide arcs, the beam trembling with the unsteady rhythm of my breathing. The trees stretched endlessly, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. Then I saw it. A shadow moved at the edge of the clearing, flickering and jagged, its shape too fluid to belong to anything natural. My flashlight landed on it for the briefest moment, and my stomach churned. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. The shape was all wrong, its edges sharp and angular, its movements disjointed and stuttering. It didn't make sense, like my eyes were fighting against the logic of what they were seeing. I stumbled back, my foot catching on a root, and the flashlight slipped from my grasp. The beam spun wildly, casting frantic, fleeting glimpses of the clearing as I scrambled to my feet. The shadow was gone, but the oppressive feeling of being watched remained, suffocating and unrelenting. The sound came again, louder this time, closer. A wet, dragging scrape that seemed to echo in my ears. I reached for the flashlight, my hands shaking, and swung it toward the source. The beam landed on something crumpled on the ground, just beyond the reach of the campfire's dying glow. It was Marcus's jacket, or what was left of it. The fabric was shredded, stained with something dark and wet. My breath hitched as I stepped closer, my legs trembling beneath me. The air around me seemed to thrum with an unnatural energy, a low, faint hum that vibrated through my chest. The carvings on the trees pulsed faintly, their sharp lines twisting and coiling, and the forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows darker, heavier. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, like it could give way at any moment, and the cold bit deeper into my skin with each passing second. The hum grew louder, threading through the silence with a rhythm that wasn't my own. My chest tightened as I turned in frantic circles, the flashlight darting through the trees, searching for any sign of Marcus. The shadow flickered again, closer this time, and the hum surged, sharp and insistent. The last thing I saw before the flashlight sputtered out was the symbol carved into the largest tree in the clearing. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a face, jagged and hollow, its empty eyes staring back at me with an intensity that froze the breath in my lungs. Then the darkness swallowed everything. The darkness was suffocating, swallowing every sound and every thought, until there was nothing left but the pounding of my heart in my ears. I stood frozen, gripping the useless flashlight in my trembling hands. The symbol, the face, was burned into my mind, its hollow, jagged eyes searing through the void like an unrelenting presence. The carvings on the trees around me pulsed faintly, their glow casting fleeting shadows that moved even when nothing else did. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, some trick of the mind brought on by exhaustion and fear. But the sensation of being watched was too real, too heavy. It pressed against my chest, a suffocating weight that made every breath a struggle. The sound came again, a wet, dragging scrape that echoed through the clearing. This time, it wasn't distant. It was too close. My legs moved on their own, carrying me backward toward the remnants of the fire. The ground beneath me felt unsteady, as though it might crumble beneath my weight at any moment. My foot caught on something, sending me sprawling to the dirt. Pain shot through my palms as they scraped against the rough ground, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins dulled the sting. I scrambled to my knees, my eyes darting through the thick darkness. The shadows seemed alive, their edges jagged and shifting, their movements too deliberate to be the work of the wind. I reached for my pack, yanking it open with frantic hands. The contents spilled across the ground: water bottles, granola bars, a map. But I was only searching for one thing. My hand closed around the handle of the hunting knife I'd brought for protection, and I pulled it free, clutching it so tightly. My knuckles turned white. The dragging sound stopped, leaving behind a silence so absolute it felt deafening. I stayed crouched, every muscle in my body tensed, my eyes darting through the clearing for any sign of movement. The glow of the carvings pulsed faintly, casting flickering light that seemed to twist and distort the space around me. A faint rustle to my left. My head snapped toward the sound, the knife trembling in my hand. The shadows there were thicker, darker, and for a moment I thought I saw them shift. My breath caught in my throat, and I tightened my grip on the blade, forcing myself to take a step forward. As I moved, the ground beneath me shifted again, a faint tremor that sent loose dirt skittering into the cracks that seemed to spread wider with every second. My heart raced as I swung the flashlight in wide arcs, the dim beam barely cutting through the oppressive black. The carvings glowed brighter now, their jagged lines twisting and coiling, almost as though they were alive. The hum returned, low and faint at first, threading through the air like a distant vibration. It grew steadily louder, filling my ears and chest, making the ground beneath my feet feel unsteady. It wasn't random, it was rhythmic, deliberate, like a pulse that wasn't my own. I stumbled toward Marcus's tent, my mind racing with desperate plans. If I could just find his tracks, something to follow, I could. The tent was gone. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The spot where Marcus's tent had stood was empty, the ground bare and undisturbed, as though it had never been there at all. My mind reeled, the impossibility of it sending panic coursing through me. I spun in frantic circles, the flashlight beam trembling as I searched the clearing. The dragging sound came again, louder this time, almost directly behind me. I whipped around, the knife raised, but there was nothing. Just darkness, just shadows. The hum surged, sharper now, slicing through the air like a knife. The carvings on the trees flared, their glow blinding for a brief moment before they dimmed again. And then I saw it. The figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the flickering light. It wasn't human. Its form was wrong, jagged and angular, its edges flickering like a dying flame. It didn't move, but its presence filled the space, suffocating and absolute. The flashlight flickered in my hand, the beam faltering as the hum grew louder, vibrating through the air with an intensity that made my chest ache. The figure stepped forward, its movements disjointed and stuttering like a puppet on fraying strings. My legs refused to move, frozen in place by a fear so profound it felt like it had taken root in my bones. The carvings pulsed again, their sharp lines glowing brighter, and the figure took another step, closer now, its jagged edges sharper. The hum surged, sharp and insistent, threading through my mind like 1,000 voices, screaming in unison. I couldn't breathe. The knife slipped from my trembling hand, falling to the ground with a dull thud. The figure loomed closer, its form breaking apart and reforming with every flicker of the dim light. The darkness closed in around me, heavy and suffocating, and the last thing I saw before the light finally sputtered out was the symbol carved into the nearest tree, its jagged lines coiling into the shape of that same hollow-eyed face. The darkness wasn't a mere absence of light anymore. It was alive, crawling across the clearing, coiling and stretching, like it was searching for something or someone. Livet died. Elise. I stumbled backward, my breaths ragged and shallow, my heart hammering against my ribcage. The figure had vanished again, but its presence lingered, heavy and oppressive, pressing against my chest like a vice. I clawed at the flashlight, slapping it with trembling hands until the beam sputtered weakly to life. The glow was faint, barely enough to illuminate the edges of the clearing, but it was enough to see the carvings etched into the trees. They had changed. The sharp, looping patterns twisted further into grotesque shapes, resembling faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths that seemed to scream silently into the void. The ground trembled beneath me, subtle at first, but growing stronger, as though something massive was stirring deep below. I turned in frantic circles, the weak beam of the flashlight sweeping across the clearing, searching for any sign of escape. The forest seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions now. The path we had taken to reach the campsite, completely gone. I froze when I noticed the trail. It wasn't a trail, not really, but a series of footprints pressed into the soft earth. They led away from the clearing, their edges faintly glowing with the same eerie light as the carvings. My stomach twisted at the sight. The prints were too large, too deep, their shape wrong, almost claw-like. But I had no choice. Standing still would be my undoing. Gripping the flashlight tightly, I followed the trail. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air around me grew denser, pressing down on me like an unseen weight. The hum returned, faint at first, threading through the silence like a faint vibration. It grew louder with every step I took, thrumming in the back of my skull and making my vision blur. The trail led me deeper into the forest, the trees around me growing thicker, their twisted branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. The carvings continued, etched into every tree I passed, their faint glow illuminating the way. The faces stared down at me, their empty eyes following my every move. Hey, I could feel them watching, waiting, their silence more terrifying than any scream. The ground shifted beneath me again, and I stumbled, catching myself against the rough bark of a tree. My hand burned where it touched the carvings, as though the symbols themselves radiated heat. I yanked it back with a hiss of pain, staring down at the faint red marks now etched into my palm. They matched the patterns on the tree, twisting and coiling in ways that made my stomach churn. The hum surged, sharp and insistent, and I staggered forward, driven by a primal need to escape. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows darker, heavier, their jagged edges slicing through the dim light. My flashlight flickered, its beam faltering, and I slammed it against my thigh, willing it to hold. Then I saw it. A cabin stood in the distance, its silhouette barely visible through the thick fog that clung to the trees. It looked ancient, its roofs sagging under the weight of moss and decay. The windows were dark, their glass shattered, and the door hung slightly ajar, swinging gently in a breeze I couldn't feel. I hesitated at the edge of the clearing, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the hum was deafening now, threading through my thoughts with an intensity that left me trembling. I had no choice. I stepped forward, each movement deliberate, the flashlight shaking in my hand. As I approached the cabin, the air grew colder the closer I got, biting into my skin like needles. The door creaked open as I reached it, the sound sharp and grating in the oppressive silence. I stepped inside, the wooden floorboards groaning under my weight, and the smell of damp earth and decay hit me like a wave. The cabin was empty, but it wasn't abandoned. The walls were covered in carvings, more intricate and grotesque than the ones outside. They twisted and coiled across every surface, their sharp lines glowing faintly, illuminating the room in a sickly green light. A single table stood in the center, its surface covered in papers and tools that looked ancient, rusted and worn. I approached the table, my fingers trembling as I reached for the papers. They were brittle, yellowed with age, and covered in symbols that matched the carvings on the walls. My eyes scanned the pages, searching for something, anything that could make sense of what was happening. One word stood out, scrawled in jagged letters across the bottom of the page: Keeper. The hum surged, sharp and discordant, and the cabin trembled around me. The walls seemed to close in, the carvings twisting and shifting, their sharp lines coiling into shapes I couldn't comprehend. The shadows at the edges of the room grew darker, heavier, their jagged edges slicing through the air. The door slammed shut behind me, and the light of the flashlight finally sputtered out. The sudden darkness consumed me, thick and oppressive, pressing against my chest like a weight. I staggered back from the table, clutching the brittle papers in my trembling hands. The hum had become unbearable now, drilling into my skull, vibrating in my teeth and bones. The carvings on the walls pulsed with an unnatural light, their lines twisting and shifting like they were alive. I turned, my back pressed against the table, and searched for any glimmer of light, any sign of a way out. The door was gone, not just closed, but gone. The space it had occupied replaced by more carvings that spiraled and looped endlessly, their faint glow casting jagged shadows across the cabin. Panic surged through me, cold and suffocating. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my palms against the wall, feeling the grooves of the carvings beneath my fingertips. They felt alive, warm and pulsing, as though they were breathing. I yanked my hands back, stumbling away, and the papers slipped from my grasp, scattering across the floor. The hum changed suddenly, shifting into something sharper, more deliberate. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was voices, whispers, low and unintelligible, threading through the air like a faint breeze. They overlapped, growing louder and more insistent, their jagged cadence clawing at the edges of my sanity. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were inside, reverberating in my mind, threading through my thoughts with a suffocating intensity. I dropped to my knees, my nails digging into the wooden floor as I fought to keep my breathing steady. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the hum stopped. The silence was worse. It was heavy, unnatural, stretching endlessly, filling the cabin like a tangible presence. I stayed frozen, my hands still pressed to my ears, every muscle in my body tensed. Slowly, I lowered them, my breath catching in my throat as the silence pressed against me, thick and suffocating. The carvings on the walls flared suddenly, their glow bright and blinding, and I shielded my eyes against the searing light. When it dimmed, I lowered my hands, and my stomach churned at what I saw. The carvings had changed again. Where once there were jagged lines and looping patterns, there were now images, grotesque and haunting, figures twisted and contorted, their hollow eyes staring back at me with a malevolent intensity. They were reaching, their spindly hands clawing toward the center of the room. I turned, following their gaze, and my breath caught in my throat. The table was no longer empty. In its center sat a single object, a small blackened relic, its surface etched with the same carvings that adorned the walls. It pulsed faintly, casting a sickly light that made the shadows around it stretch and writhe. The whispers returned, low and insistent, threading through the air like a faint breeze. I didn't want to touch it. Every instinct screamed at me to turn away, to run, to leave the cabin, and never look back. But the air around me seemed to shift, heavy and oppressive, pressing me forward. My feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the table, each step slow and deliberate. My hand trembled as I reached for the relic, my fingers hovering inches above its surface. The whispers grew louder, sharper, their jagged cadence slicing through the air. I hesitated, my chest tightening as the oppressive weight around me grew heavier, suffocating. Then I touched it. The room erupted in light and sound, blinding and deafening, and I was thrown backward, my body hitting the floor with a force that knocked the air from my lungs. The relic pulsed brighter, its light casting jagged shadows that stretched and writhed across the walls. The whispers became screams, their voices overlapping in a cacophony that clawed at my mind. I scrambled to my feet, clutching the edge of the table for support, and my eyes locked on the relic. It was changing, its surface cracking and splintering, black smoke curling from its edges. The carvings on the walls flared again, their jagged lines twisting and coiling, and the air around me seemed to vibrate with a suffocating energy. The relic cracked open, and the light inside spilled out, blinding and searing. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes, and the last thing I saw before the world went dark was the face, the same hollow-eyed, jagged face that had been carved into the trees, staring back at me from the center of the relic, its empty gaze boring into my soul. The darkness that followed was absolute. I was suspended in it, weightless, breathless, my thoughts scattered and incoherent. My body felt like it was floating, but every nerve was alight, tingling with an energy I didn't understand. The screaming whispers had stopped, leaving behind a silence so profound it was suffocating. Then, slowly, the silence began to shift. A faint, rhythmic sound emerged, low and guttural, like a distant heartbeat. It grew louder, steadier, reverberating through the void and shaking the fragile threads of my awareness. I gasped, the air rushing back into my lungs with a sharp, burning ache, and the weightlessness disappeared. My body slammed into something solid and cold, the impact jarring me back to consciousness. I opened my eyes, but the world around me was unrecognizable. The cabin was gone. The forest, the carvings, even the relic, all of it had vanished. I was in a vast, endless expanse of black, the ground beneath me a smooth obsidian surface that reflected faint, shifting lights above. The lights danced like fireflies, their glow pale and sickly, casting eerie, twisting shadows that stretched and coiled. The heartbeat grew louder, vibrating through the air, through the ground, through me. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and turned in slow, frantic circles. There was no horizon, no sky, no walls, just the endless black and the faint, flickering lights. My voice broke the silence, hoarse and trembling. Hello? The word was swallowed by the void, leaving no echo, no trace. I took a hesitant step forward, my shoes scraping against the smooth surface, the sound unnervingly loud. As I moved, the lights above shifted, their movements more deliberate, more organized. They weren't random. They were forming something, a shape. It was faint at first, the lights connecting like stars to form jagged lines and hollow spaces. The shape grew more defined with every step I took, and my stomach churned as recognition set in. It was the face, the same hollow-eyed, jagged face that had been carved into the trees, etched into the walls of the cabin, and burned into the relic. It stared down at me, its empty gaze following my every move. The heartbeat thundered now, shaking the ground beneath my feet, and the face above shifted, its jagged lines twisting into something resembling a cruel, mocking grin. I stumbled backward, my breaths shallow and ragged, my mind racing for any explanation, any way out. The ground trembled, and I fell to my knees, clutching at the smooth surface as cracks spread outward from beneath me. They glowed faintly, their sharp lines twisting and coiling, carving patterns that mirrored the face above. The air grew colder, biting into my skin, and the lights above flickered, casting fleeting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Then the ground gave way. I plummeted into the void, the air rushing past me in a deafening roar. My screams were torn from my throat, lost in the abyss as the darkness swallowed me whole. The sensation of falling was endless, my stomach twisting and churning, my body weightless and unmoored. The heartbeat faded, replaced by the whispers again, sharper and more insistent, threading through my mind like jagged blades. The fall ended abruptly. I hit the ground with a force that drove the air from my lungs, leaving me gasping and disoriented. The surface beneath me was rough and uneven, the sharp edges of stone digging into my palms as I pushed myself upright. The air was heavy, filled with the acrid stench of sulfur and decay. I was in a cavern now, the walls jagged and glistening with moisture, their surfaces carved with the same symbols that had haunted me from the start. The whispers grew louder, their cadence overlapping and chaotic, filling the cavern with a suffocating energy. I staggered to my feet, my legs trembling beneath me, and turned toward the source of the whispers. At the far end of the cavern stood an altar, its surface slick with something dark and wet. The relic sat at its center, pulsing faintly, its surface cracked and smoking. The carvings around it glowed brighter, their lines twisting and shifting, forming shapes that were almost human, but not quite. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their forms jagged and angular, their movements stuttering and disjointed. Their hollow eyes burned with an unnatural light, their gaping mouths stretching into silent screams. They surrounded the altar, their twisted shapes coiling and shifting, their presence filling the cavern with an unbearable weight. The relic pulsed brighter, its light searing and blinding, and the whispers became a roar, their jagged voices clawing at my mind. My knees buckled, and I fell to the ground, clutching my head as the noise consumed me. Through the chaos, one voice rose above the rest, sharp and clear, cutting through the cacophony like a blade. "You are the keeper." The words echoed through the cavern, through my mind, their weight crushing and absolute. The figures turned toward me in unison, their hollow eyes boring into my soul, and the relic flared, its light swallowing everything. The last thing I saw before the darkness claimed me was the face, jagged and hollow, its grin wider than before. The darkness didn't just consume me, it became me. It crawled into my lungs, filling the spaces where air should have been, seeping into every corner of my mind. I couldn't see, I couldn't hear. The weight of it pressed down on me until I wasn't sure where I ended. And it began. And then, suddenly, I was somewhere else. The air was thick with heat, the kind that sticks to your skin and sinks deep into your bones. I gasped, my chest heaving as I gulped down the heavy, sulfur-tainted air. My hands found the ground beneath me, rough, jagged, and warm to the touch, as though the earth itself was alive and pulsing with energy. I pushed myself upright, every muscle trembling, and looked around. I was standing on the edge of a vast, yawning chasm. The ground stretched out in jagged ridges, glowing faintly with veins of molten red that snaked through the cracks. The chasm below was impossibly deep, filled with swirling shadows and faint whispers that rose and fell like a tide. Across the expanse, a structure loomed, a massive spiraling tower that defied logic, its angles sharp and impossible, its surface crawling with the same shifting symbols that had haunted me since the forest. The whispers grew louder, sharper, threading through the oppressive silence. I turned in frantic circles, searching for any sign of escape, but the landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, a desolate expanse of ash and stone. The tower was the only thing that broke the monotony, its jagged silhouette rising like a wound against the burning sky. I didn't want to move toward it, but the ground beneath me shifted, tilting ever so slightly, forcing me to take a step forward to keep my balance. The whispers grew louder, their cadence overlapping and discordant, and the chasm seemed to draw closer, its edges crumbling beneath my feet. There was no choice. Down. The path to the tower was narrow, a jagged bridge of stone that seemed to form as I walked. Each step felt like a gamble, the ground beneath me trembling and groaning as though it might give way at any moment. The air grew heavier the closer I got, thick with the acrid stench of sulfur and decay, and the whispers became voices, low and guttural, threading through my mind with a suffocating intensity. The base of the tower was even more massive, up close, its surface pulsating with a faint, sickly light. The symbols etched into the stone twisted and writhed, their sharp lines forming shapes I couldn't comprehend. A doorway yawned open at the base, its edges jagged and uneven, and the darkness inside seemed alive, writhing and shifting as though waiting to devour me. I stepped inside. The air changed instantly, the heat replaced by a bone-deep chill that made my skin crawl. The interior of the tower was impossibly vast, its walls stretching upward into a darkness so absolute it felt like it might swallow me whole. The carvings on the walls glowed faintly, their light casting jagged shadows that danced and flickered, their movements unnatural. The whispers surrounded me now, louder and more insistent, their voices overlapping in a cacophony that clawed at my sanity. They weren't random. They were words, fragmented and disjointed, threading through the air in a language I didn't understand, but somehow felt deep in my bones. The tower pulsed around me, the ground beneath my feet vibrating with an energy that felt alive. The walls seemed to close in as I moved deeper, their surfaces slick and pulsing, and the whispers grew sharper, their cadence cutting through the heavy air like a blade. At the center of the tower, I found it, the relic. It hovered above a jagged pedestal, its surface cracked and pulsing with a light so bright it hurt to look at. The symbols etched into it shifted and writhed, their sharp lines twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to claw at the air around them. The whispers surged, louder than ever, and the air around the relic warped, rippling like the surface of disturbed water. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to run, to escape this nightmare. But the tower groaned around me, the walls trembling, the carvings flaring brighter, and I knew there was no going back. The voices demanded something of me, their jagged cadence sharp and insistent, and I felt myself move forward, my legs trembling, my hands reaching out. The moment I touched it, the world exploded. Light and sound tore through me, searing and deafening, and I was thrown backward, my body slamming into the ground with enough force to leave me breathless. The relic pulsed brighter, its surface cracking further, and the symbols carved into it flared, their lines twisting into shapes that coiled and writhed like living things. The voices rose into a scream, their jagged edges slicing through my mind, and the walls of the tower trembled, the carvings twisting and shifting. The air grew heavier, suffocating, and the ground beneath me cracked, glowing veins of molten red spreading outward. The last thing I saw before the world was swallowed by darkness was the face, jagged, hollow-eyed, grinning. And then, nothing. The darkness was different this time. It wasn't silent. It throbbed with a low, pulsating hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, all at once. I couldn't tell if I was standing, floating, or lying down. My sense of self was fragmented, like pieces of me were drifting apart into the void, leaving only shards behind. Then, faintly at first, I began to hear them again. The whispers. They were quieter now, no longer overlapping in a chaotic cacophony, but threading together in a single cohesive rhythm. Their voices curled and twisted around me, threading through my mind, drawing me back into awareness. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in the tower anymore. I was standing in a space that defied reason. The ground beneath me was smooth and reflective, like glass, but it rippled faintly as I moved, distorting the faint glow of the horizon. Above, the sky was a swirling mass of black and gray, fractured by jagged lines of glowing red that crackled and surged like lightning frozen in time. The whispers were louder now, surrounding me like a living thing, guiding my gaze forward. There, in the center of the endless expanse, stood a figure. It wasn't human, at least, not entirely. Its form was jagged and fragmented, its edges shifting and coiling like smoke. The symbols that had haunted me since the beginning were etched into its surface, glowing faintly, their sharp lines twisting and writhing. Its eyes were hollow and black, but they radiated a presence so overwhelming, I felt my knees buckle beneath me. The whispers surged as the figure moved closer, its steps silent but heavy, each one vibrating through the air and into my chest. I tried to move, to run, but my body refused to obey. I was rooted in place, frozen by a force that pressed against me from all sides. The figure stopped mere feet away, towering over me, its hollow eyes boring into my soul. Its presence was suffocating, its form flickering and shifting, the symbols on its surface glowing brighter with each passing moment. When it spoke, its voice wasn't a sound, but a vibration resonating through the air, through me, threading into the very fabric of my being. You are the keeper. The words reverberated through me, sharp and final, and the whispers surged, their jagged cadence forming a single unified chorus. The Kir raised a hand, or what resembled one, its jagged edges shimmering with a faint crimson light. The air around it warped and rippled, bending under the weight of its presence. I felt it before I saw it, a pulse of energy that radiated outward, slamming into me like a tidal wave. My body was lifted off the ground, weightless and suspended in the air, as the whispers consumed me, threading through my mind, tearing apart every thought, every memory, every shred of who I was. The world around me fractured. The smooth, glassy ground cracked beneath me, glowing veins of molten red spreading outward in jagged line. The sky above churned violently, the glowing red fractures spreading like a web, and the air itself seemed to tremble, vibrating with an unbearable energy. The figure loomed closer, its presence filling every corner of my awareness, and the symbols on its surface twisted and coiled, forming shapes I couldn't comprehend. Its hollow eyes burned with a terrible light, and when it spoke again, its voice was louder, sharper, cutting through the chaos like a blade. It is done. The ground gave way, and I fell. This time, there was no end to the fall. The world around me dissolved into a swirling mass of black and red, the whispers threading through the chaos like tendrils. My body twisted and coiled, weightless and unmoored, as the fractured pieces of my mind were drawn into the void, merging with the endless living darkness. I didn't hit the ground. I became it. The whispers weren't around me anymore. They were inside me, threading through every corner of my awareness, filling the spaces where my thoughts had been. The jagged lines of the symbols burned in my vision, etched into the fabric of my being, twisting and coiling, forming shapes that felt both foreign and familiar. I opened my eyes, and the world reassembled itself. A new bee was seemed. I was standing in the forest again. The trees around me twisted and gnarled, their branches clawing at the sky. The carvings were gone, the glowing symbols erased, as though they had never existed. The relic was gone too, its absence a weight that pressed against my chest, sharp and suffocating. But I wasn't the same. Oh, do you believe? The whispers were silent now, but their presence lingered, threading through the edges of my thoughts, coiled tightly around the fragments of who I used to be. The symbols burned faintly beneath my skin, their sharp lines twisting and shifting, and I knew they would never leave me. The forest was quiet, unnaturally so, the weight of the silence heavier than anything I had ever known. I took a step forward, and the ground beneath me felt wrong, too soft, too alive. The trees seemed to shift as I moved, their twisted shapes leaning closer, their jagged branches stretching toward me. I walked until I found the clearing. The campsite was still there, untouched, as though the events of the night had been nothing more than a nightmare. But the weight in my chest told me otherwise. The world was different now, fractured and broken, and I was a part of it, a piece of something far greater, far darker than I could ever comprehend. As I stood there, staring at the empty fire pit and the scattered remnants of our gear, I heard it again. The hum, low and faint, threading through the silence, growing louder with every passing moment. I closed my eyes, the weight of it pressing against me, and when I opened them again, the forest was gone. The forest swallowed sound, the way the sea swallows light. Every step I took felt muffled, like the ground itself was conspiring to keep us quiet. The others followed close behind, their faces pale and drawn, illuminated only by the weak beam of my flashlight. The signal on the radio had been faint at first, a garbled voice that barely registered over the static. But as we followed it deeper into the woods, it had grown louder, clearer, almost commanding. It wasn't supposed to be like this. How can it be well? A weekend camping trip in Pennsylvania's Allegheny Forest had sounded like a perfect escape. Tents, a fire, beers. It was simple, harmless. And then, around midnight, the signal came. I remember the way it pierced through the static like a knife, a sharp, rhythmic tone followed by a voice. Low and guttural, speaking words I couldn't understand. We thought it was a prank at first, some local messing with us. But when we switched the frequency, the same voice followed. No matter where we tuned, it was there, relentless, whispering in that strange, guttural cadence. And then, like a beacon, the voice gave coordinates. We laughed it off. Who wouldn't? Coordinates. Deep in the woods, given by a disembodied voice. It was ridiculous, but the laugh didn't last. Curiosity works fast when there's nothing else to do. And soon enough, we were packing up flashlights and maps, ready to chase the impossible. That was 3 hours ago. I'm down, quit. Now, the laughter was gone. It had been replaced by something heavier, thicker, a silence that pressed down on us with every step. Even the usual sounds of the forest had disappeared. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just the crunch of our boots on the uneven ground and the faint hum of the radio, which now emitted nothing but that rhythmic tone. The trees seemed to grow closer together the farther we walked, their branches intertwining to form jagged shapes that clawed at the sky. My flashlight flickered, the beam cutting through the dense fog that had settled around us like a veil. The air was damp and heavy, tinged with the metallic scent of earth, and something faintly sour. It clung to my skin, to my lungs, making every breath feel labored. Look, Tan, the words slipped from my lips, before I realized I'd spoken. Ahead, through the tangle of branches and fog, a faint light glowed. It wasn't natural, too sharp, too steady. It pulsed faintly, casting long, jagged shadows that danced like specters. The others hesitated, but I couldn't stop. Something about the light pulled at me, irrational and insistent. My steps quickened, the soft hum of the radio growing louder with every stride. The trees seemed to part as I approached, revealing a clearing at the edge of a steep ravine. And there, nestled against the dark rock face, was the entrance to a mine. Wadiwutadlanga, and the light came from within. The entrance was marked by two massive wooden beams, splintered and weathered with age. Strange symbols were carved into the wood, their sharp lines glowing faintly with the same sickly light that pulsed from deeper within. The carvings twisted and writhed, their shapes impossible to follow, as though they changed the moment I looked away. I froze at the threshold, my breath catching in my throat. Something moved in the shadows, just beyond the light. It was quick, a flicker of motion that was gone before I could register it. My flashlight beam wavered, catching the edge of the rock face, where more symbols had been etched into the stone. Behind me, the others stopped. No one spoke, but I could feel their unease, their hesitation. The hum from the radio surged, its pitch rising until it was almost unbearable. And then, without warning, the signal stopped. The silence was deafening. It lasted only a moment. Then a sound emerged, a low, guttural whisper, threading through the darkness like a blade. It wasn't coming from the radio. It was coming from the mine. My body moved before my mind could catch up. I stepped forward, crossing the threshold, my flashlight slicing through the thick, cloying air. The whispers grew louder, overlapping and chaotic, forming words I couldn't understand, but that still made my stomach churn. The light inside was stronger now, casting long shadows that stretched and coiled like living things. The walls of the mine were damp, the rock slick and uneven, and the carvings were everywhere, glowing brighter the deeper I went. The whispers seemed to come from the walls themselves, threading through the cracks and crevices, their cadence sharp and insistent. I turned a corner and froze. Eliud, at the center of the chamber ahead, a figure stood. Uvo, Elnenya, Investul. It wasn't human. Its form was jagged and angular, its edges shifting and flickering like a shadow cast by an unseen flame. The symbols that had haunted us were etched into its surface, glowing faintly, their sharp lines twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to claw at the air around it. It turned, slowly, its hollow eyes meeting mine. The whispers stopped. The silence pressed down on me like a weight, and my flashlight flickered, its beam catching the jagged edges of the figure's form. My body refused to move, every muscle frozen as the figure took a step forward. The air around it rippled and warped, bending under the weight of its presence. When it spoke, Its voice wasn't a sound, but a vibration, threading through the heavy air, through me. "You are not supposed to be here." The words echoed through the chamber, sharp and final, and the walls trembled, the carvings flaring brighter, the ground beneath me cracked, glowing veins of molten red spreading outward. The figure stepped closer, its hollow eyes burning with a terrible light, and I knew, with a certainty that pierced through the fog of fear, that we had made a terrible mistake. The air inside the mine thickened, clinging to my skin like a second layer. Each step I took seemed heavier than the last, the whispers pressing against my mind like a living thing. Behind me, the others hesitated, their flashlights casting erratic beams that danced across the walls, illuminating the jagged symbols that twisted and writhed, as if alive. The figure loomed closer, its edges flickering like static on an old television screen. Its hollow eyes bore into me, and I felt my breath hitch, my chest tightening under its oppressive gaze. It was wrong in every way, as though it didn't belong to this world. Or worse, as though it belonged more than we ever could. "Turn back," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible over the cacophony of whispers that filled the space. But the others didn't move. Maybe force makes you. None of us could. The figure raised what might have been an arm, though its shape shifted and splintered like smoke trapped in glass. The symbols etched into its surface glowed brighter, their sharp lines pulsing in rhythm with the low hum that vibrated through the air. A chill ran down my spine as I realized the hum wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the walls. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence was immediate and absolute, the kind that makes your ears ring. In its absence, the figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion that felt impossibly wrong, and the ground beneath me seemed to tremble. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the figure dissolved into a cascade of black smoke, its form twisting upward into the darkness above. The light from our flashlights flickered violently, and the walls seemed to close in, the carvings glowing with a feverish intensity. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, vibrating through the very bones of the mine. My flashlight caught movement at the edge of the chamber, a flicker of motion, too fast to follow. The growl grew louder, accompanied by a rhythmic thudding, like the pounding of a massive heartbeat. "Move!" I shouted, my voice cracking as panic surged through me. My feet found traction, and I stumbled forward, deeper into the mine, though every instinct screamed to turn back. The others followed, their footfalls echoing behind me, frantic and uneven. The tunnel narrowed as we ran, the air growing colder, sharper. The light from our flashlights barely penetrated the oppressive darkness, and the walls seemed to pulse with life, the symbols shifting and twisting like living veins. My chest burned, each breath a struggle against the suffocating weight that pressed down on us. We rounded a corner and burst into another chamber, larger this time, its ceiling disappearing into the darkness above. At the center of the space stood an altar, roughly hewn from the same black stone that lined the walls. Strange objects were scattered across its surface. Bones that didn't look entirely human. Shards of metal that shimmered with an unnatural glow. And a black orb that seemed to drink in the light. The whispers returned, louder this time, their cadence sharp and jagged, overlapping in a chaotic symphony that made my head throb. The orb pulsed faintly, its surface rippling like water, and I felt an almost magnetic pull toward it. "Don't," one of the others rasped, but their voice was distant, drowned out by the whispers. My hand moved on its own, reaching for the orb, my fingers brushing against its surface. It was cold, impossibly so, and the moment I touched it, the world seemed to lurch. The whispers stopped again, but this time, the silence was worse. It was as though the air had been sucked from the chamber, leaving a void that pressed against my ears and chest. The orb began to glow faintly, its light seeping into the cracks of the altar, spreading like veins through the stone. And then the ground split. A deep, resonant crack echoed through the chamber, and the floor beneath the altar gave way, revealing a pit of swirling darkness. The glow from the orb intensified, and a figure began to rise from the void, taller than the first, its form even more fragmented and jagged. Its hollow eyes burned with a crimson light, and the symbols etched into its surface pulsed in time with the orb's glow. It spoke, its voice a rumble that shook the walls and rattled my teeth. "You were warned." The ground trembled violently, and chunks of stone began to fall from the ceiling, crashing to the floor in deafening explosions. The others shouted, their voices panicked and distant, but I couldn't move. The figure's gaze was locked on me, its presence suffocating, its words threading through my mind like a razor. "The keeper must be chosen." The words cut through the chaos, sharp and final, and the whispers surged again, louder than ever. The figure raised its jagged arms, and the air around us warped, bending and twisting, as though the mine itself were alive. The altar cracked and splintered, and the orb began to sink into the darkness below, its light fading. The chamber collapsed into chaos. "Iltul en azir collapsed into chaos." I felt hands grab my arm, pulling me back toward the tunnel, as the ground beneath us fractured and gave way. We ran, the walls around us shuddering, the carvings glowing brighter, their shapes shifting into jagged, incomprehensible patterns. The growl returned, louder and closer, echoing through the collapsing mine. And then, just as we reached the mouth of the tunnel, everything went silent. The silence after the chaos was deafening, like the mine itself had sucked every sound into the void we'd barely escaped. My legs burned, my chest heaved, but I couldn't stop moving. The tunnel stretched ahead, darker than before, as though the mine had swallowed the light completely. My flashlight flickered in my trembling hand, the beam barely cutting through the thick, soupy blackness. Behind me, the others stumbled, their footsteps uneven, punctuated by panicked breaths and the occasional muffled curse. No one spoke, but the silence was worse. It carried weight, pressing against us like the walls themselves were alive, leaning closer, waiting. We didn't stop until the ground beneath us leveled out, the jagged rocks replaced by damp, uneven dirt. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and something sharper, metallic, that clung to the back of my throat. My flashlight beam wavered as I scanned the tunnel, the light catching on more of those impossible carvings etched into the walls. Their sharp, angular shapes seemed to twist in ways that made my stomach churn, like they weren't meant to be understood. "We have to go back," someone whispered behind me, their voice barely audible. It sounded far away, like it had to push through the same oppressive weight that was pressing on my chest. I didn't answer. There was no going back, not through the collapsing chamber and whatever was rising from that pit. And yet, moving forward felt just as impossible. The tunnel stretched on endlessly, the darkness ahead so thick it seemed to swallow the weak light of our flashlights. Whoa! The walls pulsed faintly with an unnatural glow, and the air hummed with a low, almost imperceptible vibration that made my teeth ache. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping, echoing through the tunnel. It was slow at first, almost hesitant, like something testing its surroundings. My heart stuttered, and I raised my flashlight, the beam jittering as my hand shook. The sound grew louder, closer, and then I saw it. A figure emerged from the darkness, its form hunched and unnatural, its movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending in ways that made my skin crawl. The carvings on the walls glowed brighter as it approached, casting flickering shadows that danced across its fragmented form. Its head tilted, a sharp bird-like motion, and I froze. Its face, or what should have been its face, was smooth and featureless, a blank expanse that reflected the faint glow of the carvings. But I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating, as though it was peering directly into me, peeling back every layer until there was nowhere left to hide. The tapping stopped. For a moment, everything was still. The figure stood motionless, its two long limbs hanging at unnatural angles, the glow from the walls casting jagged shadows that seemed to shift and twist on their own. My breath caught, my body frozen in place, as I waited for it to move, to lunge, to do anything. And then it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It wasn't even a sound, not in the way voices are supposed to be. It was a vibration, a low, resonant hum that threaded through the air and settled deep in my chest. The carvings on the walls flared brighter, and I felt the words more than I heard them. Keeper, chosen, bound. The tunnel trembled, dust raining down from the ceiling, and the figure raised one impossibly long arm, pointing down the path ahead. The glow from the carvings pulsed in time with the vibrations, and I felt a pull, an irresistible force drawing me forward. My feet moved on their own, one step, then another, until I was moving toward the figure. "No!" Someone hissed behind me, their voice sharp with panic. A hand grabbed my arm, pulling me back, and the spell broke. The figure didn't move, but the vibrations grew louder, the air around it shimmering like heat waves. The carvings on the walls began to twist and writhe, their shapes shifting into jagged, incomprehensible patterns that made my head throb. "We have to go," someone else said, their voice trembling. "No." I turned, my legs stiff and unsteady, and we ran. The tapping resumed behind us, faster now, echoing through the tunnel in a frantic rhythm that matched the pounding of my heart. The light from our flashlights bounced wildly as we stumbled over uneven ground, the walls around us seeming to close in, the glow from the carvings pulsating like a heartbeat. Tunnel opened into another chamber, smaller this time, its walls lined with jagged crystals that glowed faintly in the darkness. The air was colder here, sharp and biting, and the whispers returned, threading through the air like a living thing. At the center of the chamber was a pedestal, and atop it sat a fragment of the orb we'd seen before. It was cracked, its surface dull and jagged, but it pulsed faintly with the same sickly light as the carvings. I felt that pull again, stronger this time, and before I could stop myself, I was reaching for it. The moment my fingers touched the fragment, the whispers stopped. The light from the carvings flared, and the ground beneath us shuddered violently. A fissure split the floor, jagged and glowing, and the air filled with that guttural growl. Deeper and louder than before, the fragment burned against my palm, and I felt a surge of something. Power, pain, fear, all at once. The chamber trembled, the crystals lining the walls shattering one by one, and the growl grew louder, a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. And then the floor gave way. The sensation of falling was both infinite and instantaneous. My stomach lurched, my breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I was weightless, suspended in the darkness. The air screamed around me, a deafening rush that drowned out even my thoughts, until impact. I hit the ground hard, the force knocking the wind from my lungs and sending a sharp pain shooting up my side. For a moment, I couldn't move, the world spinning around me in a disorienting blur. My flashlight had slipped from my grasp, its weak beam casting jagged shadows across the cavernous space I now found myself in. The fragment was still clutched in my other hand, its edges sharp and biting against my skin. A groan echoed somewhere nearby, followed by the scrape of shifting rocks. The others, they had fallen with me. Is everyone okay? My voice came out hoarse, barely audible over the pounding in my ears. I forced myself to sit up, every muscle protesting the movement, and squinted into the dim light. Shapes began to take form. Rocks, jagged and uneven, scattered across the cavern floor. Walls that rose impossibly high, their surfaces etched with more of those twisting, writhing carvings. And further in the distance, a faint glow. "Over here," someone called, their voice trembling. I turned, my flashlight beam catching one of the others as they pushed themselves upright, their face pale and drawn. Beyond them, another figure stirred, coughing as they tried to shake off the fall. We were alive. Somehow, Against all odds, we had survived. The relief was short-lived. A sound emerged from the darkness. A low, guttural rumble that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was deeper than the growls we'd heard before, more resonant, vibrating through the air and into my very bones. My flashlight flickered, its beam trembling as the rumble grew louder, shifting into a rhythmic thudding like the footsteps of something massive. The glow in the distance brightened, casting long, jagged shadows that stretched across the cavern floor. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain that lanced through my side, and reached for the others, pulling them up with me. "We need to move," I said, my voice sharper now, the urgency rising in my chest like a tide. They didn't argue. None of us needed to be told twice. The cavern stretched on endlessly, its walls curving in ways that defied logic, the carvings twisting into patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. The glow ahead grew brighter as we stumbled forward, its pulsing light casting the space in a sickly hue that made my skin crawl. The fragment in my hand grew warmer with every step, its faint hum resonating with the glow, as though they were connected. And then we saw it. The source of the light was a massive structure, rising from the cavern floor like a jagged monolith. It was made of the same black stone as the altar we'd seen before, its surface etched with more carvings that glowed with a faint, unearthly light. The structure twisted and spiraled upward, its edges sharp and irregular, and at its center was a gaping void, dark and endless, ringed with glowing symbols that pulsed in rhythm with my unwind. The rumble grew louder, more insistent, and the air around us seemed to vibrate, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. I felt the pull again, stronger than ever, dragging me toward the monolith, toward the void. I couldn't resist. My feet moved on their own, the fragment in my hand growing hotter, its hum louder. The others called out, their voices distant. But I couldn't stop. The void called to me, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I reached the base of the monolith and hesitated, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. The void was alive. I could feel it, a presence vast and incomprehensible, pressing against my mind with an intensity that made my vision blur. The fragment burned against my palm, its light flaring as it resonated with the void. And I understood with a sickening certainty that it wanted to go back. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I raised the fragment and stepped forward. The moment the fragment touched the void, the world shattered. The light flared, blinding and all-consuming, and the rumble became a roar, deafening and raw, a sound that tore through me like a storm. The carvings on the monolith flared brighter, their sharp lines twisting into impossible shapes, and the ground beneath me trembled violently. A force surged through the void, through the fragment, through me. It was unlike anything I'd ever felt, a raw, primal energy that coursed through every fiber of my being, overwhelming and excruciating. I screamed, the sound lost in the chaos, as the force pulled at me, tearing at the edges of my mind, my soul. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The light faded, the roar subsided, and the cavern fell into an eerie, suffocating silence. I collapsed to the ground, the fragment slipping from my hand. Its glow extinguished. My body trembled, my breaths ragged and uneven, and for a moment I couldn't move, couldn't think. When I finally looked up, the monolith was gone. The void remained. The void loomed before me, vast and unrelenting. I would stand, leave the soul. It wasn't just an absence of light or space. It was a presence, a thing that breathed and moved. Though I couldn't see its edges, it pulsed faintly, a low, rhythmic throb that reverberated through the cavern, through my bones and through my thoughts. I felt it reach out, not with hands, but with an overwhelming weight. A pull so deep and primal, it threatened to unmoor me completely. I stumbled backward, the ground beneath my feet uneven and treacherous. My legs felt weak, my chest tight, as though the air around me had grown heavy, too thick to draw in properly. Behind me, the others were shouting, sharp, panicked voices that barely registered. Their words blurred into one another, drowned out by the pounding of my heart and the relentless hum of the void. I turned to them, desperate for an anchor, but their faces mirrored my terror. Their wide eyes darted between me and the void, their mouths moving soundlessly as the oppressive hum swallowed everything else. One of them, Emily, I think, reached for me, her hand trembling as though it might disintegrate under the weight of whatever surrounded us. But before she could grab me, the ground shifted. A sharp crack echoed through the cavern, and the floor beneath us trembled violently. Jagged fissures split the earth, glowing faintly with the same sickly light that had emanated from the monolith. The void pulsed brighter in response, its rhythm quickening, and the pull grew stronger, dragging at my limbs, at my thoughts. Emily screamed, her voice cutting through the oppressive hum, and the spell broke. I turned, grabbing her arm and yanking her toward the others as the ground continued to fracture. Rocks fell from above, smashing into the cavern floor with deafening crashes, and the air filled with a suffocating haze of dust and earth. "Run!" I shouted, though my voice felt small, insignificant against the vastness of the void. But they heard me, or maybe they didn't need to. Instinct took over, and we stumbled forward, away from the fissures, away from the void. The light from the cracks grew brighter, the hum louder, until it felt like the entire world was splitting apart. The cavern twisted around us, its walls writhing like something alive. The carvings etched into the stone pulsed with a frantic energy, their shapes distorting and overlapping, creating patterns that made my head spin and my stomach churn. I kept moving, dragging Emily with me, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I fought to keep my footing. Behind us, the void roared. It was a sound like nothing I'd ever heard. Deep and guttural, filled with rage and hunger. The air vibrated with its force, the ground trembling beneath its weight. I didn't dare look back. I didn't need to. I could feel it, that relentless pull, as though the void itself was chasing us, reaching for us with unseen hands. Ahead, the tunnel narrowed, its jagged walls pressing closer together. The air grew colder, sharper, biting at my skin as we stumbled forward. The hum of the void faded slightly, replaced by the sound of rushing water, faint at first, then louder, a steady roar that seemed to echo from every direction. We emerged into another chamber, smaller than the last, but just as alien. A subterranean river cut through the center, its dark waters glowing faintly with that same unnatural light. The carvings on the walls here were deeper, more intricate, their lines converging into a massive spiral that centered on the river. The air buzzed with energy, electric and alive, and the pull of the void lessened, though it didn't disappear. "We can't stop," I said, my voice hoarse, as the others stumbled to a halt. Their faces pale and streaked with dust. I could see the exhaustion in their eyes, the way their bodies sagged under the weight of fear and adrenaline. But there was no time. The void was still behind us, its presence a constant pressure that threatened to crush us completely. I moved toward the river, the glow from its waters casting strange shadows across the chamber. The air here was colder, sharper, and the buzzing energy seemed to intensify as I stepped closer. I felt the fragment in my pocket hum faintly, resonating with the carvings on the walls and the water below. "What are you doing?" someone asked, their voice high and frantic. I didn't answer. I didn't know. I was moving on instinct now, drawn forward by something I couldn't name, couldn't understand. The spiral on the wall seemed to shift as I approached, its lines twisting into new patterns, new shapes that pulled at the edges of my mind. I reached the edge of the river and hesitated. The water was clear but impossibly deep, its surface rippling faintly with an unseen current. The light emanating from it was soft but unrelenting, casting the chamber in a pale, ghostly glow. I knelt, my hand trembling, as I reached out to touch the surface. The moment my fingers broke the water, the carvings on the walls flared to life. The spiral twisted violently, its lines writhing and overlapping until they formed a single jagged symbol that burned itself into my vision. The chamber trembled, the air buzzing with a deafening intensity, and the water beneath me surged upward, engulfing my hand, my arm, my entire body. I was pulled under. The cold was shocking, like knives slicing through my skin. But it wasn't just physical. It was deeper, an icy grip that wrapped around my thoughts, my memories, dragging me down into an endless, suffocating void. I thrashed, my lungs burning as I fought against the pull, but it was no use. The current was too strong, the force too relentless, and then, just as suddenly, it stopped. I was floating, weightless, suspended in the dark. The water around me was still, impossibly still, and the light from the carvings faded into nothing. I couldn't see, couldn't move, but I could feel it. The presence of something vast and ancient pressing against my mind with a crushing force. It whispered to me, not in words, but in sensations, in images that flickered through my thoughts like a dream I couldn't wake from. I saw the void, the monolith, the fragment, and then I saw myself, standing at the center of it all, the carvings twisting around me like living things. And then I was falling. Again, the sensation of falling was eternal. The water had pulled me into an abyss far deeper than I could comprehend. And yet, there was no impact, no bottom to this descent. My mind reeled as I tried to orient myself, to grasp onto something tangible in the suffocating darkness. The cold was no longer physical. It was an emptiness, an ache that burrowed into my soul, hollowing me out with every second that passed. Then there was light. It started as a faint glimmer, barely perceptible in the void. It pulsed rhythmically, growing brighter with each beat, until it consumed the darkness entirely. My feet found solid ground, though I didn't recall landing, and the weightless pull of the abyss faded. I was standing in a vast open expanse, its floor smooth and glass-like, reflecting the pulsating glow from above. The light was coming from a figure. At first, it was just a silhouette, a shape that seemed human, but wasn't. Its edges were blurred, shimmering like heat waves, and its movements were slow, deliberate. It stood at the center of the expanse, radiating a power that I could feel in my bones, in the very fabric of my being. I couldn't tell if it was moving toward me, or if I was being drawn toward it. Either way, the distance between us was closing. The hum returned, louder now, resonating through the expanse and vibrating in my chest. It was the same hum I'd felt from the fragment, from the carvings, from the void. But here, it was alive. A presence that pressed against my thoughts, with an intensity that made my knees buckle. I fell to the ground, gasping for breath, as the figure loomed closer. Its glow intensified, washing over me, in waves that were both searing and soothing, a contradiction that I couldn't begin to understand. And then it spoke, not with words, not with sound, but with a thought, an idea that bloomed fully formed in my mind. You are the key. The phrase reverberated through me, twisting and warping, as though it carried more meaning than the words themselves could convey. I tried to respond, to scream or protest or question, but my voice was swallowed by the hum, by the presence that consumed everything around me. The figure reached out, its hand, or what I thought was a hand, hovering inches from my chest. The glow around it pulsed violently, and I felt the fragment in my pocket vibrate in response. The hum grew deafening, and for a moment I thought I might be torn apart by the sheer force of it. Then the figure touched me. A searing pain shot through my body, so intense it felt like I was being ripped apart molecule by molecule. My vision blurred, my mind splintered, and I saw everything. The void, the monolith, the carvings, the river, all of it connected, an intricate web that stretched across dimensions, across realities, its threads converging at a single point. Me. Images flashed before my eyes, too fast to comprehend, too vast to contain. I saw the moment the fragment had been carved from the monolith, the rituals performed to harness its power, the countless lives consumed by its pull. And then I saw what lay beyond. The void was not an absence, but a doorway, a gateway to something far greater and far more terrible than I could have imagined. Oh, it was alive, vast and ancient and hungry, and its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I felt its gaze turn toward me, its attention focused entirely on my fragile existence. The glow around the figure dimmed, and the pain subsided. I collapsed onto the ground, trembling, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The figure stepped back, its form flickering as though it might dissolve at any moment. Its thoughts pressed against mine once more, softer this time, though no less powerful. You must choose. I didn't understand. My mind was too fragmented, too overwhelmed by the enormity of what I'd seen, to grasp what it meant. But the figure didn't wait for an answer. It began to fade, its glow dimming until it was nothing more than a faint outline against the infinite expanse. The hum softened, replaced by a silence that was almost worse, a void that pressed against my thoughts with a suffocating weight. And then I was back. The river was gone, the cavern silent. The others stood nearby, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. I felt the fragment in my pocket, its edges cool against my skin, and I knew with a sickening certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The void was waiting, and it was hungry. The silence was unbearable. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of something worse. An emptiness that pressed against my ears, my chest, my thoughts. My pulse thudded loudly in the void, the only proof I was still alive. The others stood frozen, their faces hollowed by fear, their shadows long and distorted against the cavern walls. I clutched the fragment in my pocket, its sharp edges pressing into my palm like a lifeline. It pulsed faintly, in sync with the racing of my heart, as if the object and I were bound together now, inseparable. The cavern around us seemed smaller than before, its walls closing in, the carvings twisting into impossible shapes that defied understanding. I felt it before I saw it. The presence of the void. It seeped into the space like an uninvited guest, a heavy, suffocating weight that settled over us. The air grew colder, and my breath came out in visible puffs, the moisture freezing almost instantly. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there. But my body refused to move. It was as though the void had wrapped its tendrils around me, rooting me in place. The ground trembled beneath our feet, a deep rumble that built steadily into a violent quake. Cracks snaked across the cavern floor, glowing with the same unnatural light as the river. The hum returned, low and steady at first, then louder, stronger, until it filled the space entirely, vibrating through my bones. Do you feel that? Someone whispered, their voice barely audible over the rising hum. I couldn't respond. My throat was dry, my tongue heavy, my thoughts scrambled. I only nodded, though I wasn't sure who I was nodding to. The light intensified, blinding and relentless, and the hum reached a deafening crescendo. And then, as quickly as it had come, it stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before. The cracks in the ground stopped glowing, their light replaced by an inky blackness that seemed to ripple and shift. The void was here, fully, completely, and it was watching us. A shape emerged from the darkness, its form undefined and shifting, like smoke trapped in water. It towered above us, its edges dissolving and reforming. With each passing second, I couldn't look away, though every instinct in my body screamed for me to do so. Its presence was overwhelming, its sheer size and weight crushing, and yet it moved with an unnatural grace, deliberate and slow. The fragment in my pocket burned, a searing heat that spread through my body, pulling me toward the shape. I staggered forward, my limbs no longer my own, the pull of the void irresistible. The others shouted, their voices frantic, but I couldn't make out their words. It was as if I were underwater, the sound distorted and distant, the world fading away. I stopped just short of the shape, my entire body trembling. The void loomed above me, its shifting form impossibly large, impossibly ancient. And then it spoke, not in words, not in sound, but in a presence that filled every corner of my mind. Its thoughts pressed against mine, alien and incomprehensible, yet they carried a single undeniable command: surrender. The fragment in my pocket pulsed violently, its light spilling out into the cavern. The void recoiled slightly, its form flickering, and I realized that the fragment wasn't just a part of it. It was a weapon, a piece of something that had been used to contain or repel it. It wanted the fragment back, but it also feared it. I gripped the fragment tightly, the heat almost unbearable now. Hey, my thoughts were a whirlwind of panic and confusion, but amidst the chaos, one thing was clear. I couldn't give it what it wanted. To do so would be to lose everything, not just myself, but the others, the world, reality itself. The void surged forward, its form collapsing inward, condensing into a dense, swirling mass. It lashed out, its tendrils reaching for me, for the fragment, for everything. I felt its pull, stronger than before, and the cavern around us began to dissolve, its walls and floor fading into the same inky blackness. I acted without thinking. Pulling the fragment from my pocket, I held it aloft, its light blazing brighter than the sun. The void shrieked. Not a sound, but a vibration, a force that shook the very fabric of the space around us. The fragment burned in my hand, its edges slicing into my palm, but I didn't let go. I couldn't. The light from the fragment expanded, washing over the cavern, over the void, over everything. The darkness recoiled, its form unraveling, its presence weakening. The hum grew louder, deeper, more frantic, until it reached a pitch that felt like it might tear me apart. And then, with one final, deafening burst of light, it was gone. The silence that followed was absolute. I fell to my knees, the fragment slipping from my hand and clattering to the ground. The others rushed to me, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes wide with shock. None of us spoke. There was nothing to say. The void was gone, or at least I thought it was. But the cavern around us was still and empty, its carvings dark and lifeless. The air heavy with the weight of what had just happened. I picked up the fragment, its light now dim and faint, and slipped it back into my pocket. The others helped me to my feet, their hands trembling as much as mine, and we began to make our way out of the cavern. As we climbed, the hum lingered in my ears, a faint echo of something vast and ancient, something that wasn't gone, not completely. The void had retreated, but I knew, deep down, that it was still watching, still waiting, and it wasn't finished. The air was heavy, pressing against me as I stepped into the abandoned cabin. The door creaked ominously, its hinges rusted with age. A damp, sour smell hit me immediately, a mix of mildew and decay. My flashlight beam wavered, casting jagged shadows against the crumbling walls and peeling wallpaper. The place felt alive in a way that buildings shouldn't. Every inch seemed to breathe, to watch. This wasn't just an old, forgotten house. Eerie, the locals had whispered its name with a mix of fear and reverence. The Bleeding House. Stories of strange occurrences, of people entering and never leaving, had turned it into an urban legend, a legend we were foolish enough to explore. I wasn't alone, though I may as well have been. The others lingered near the threshold, their silhouettes faint against the dim glow from outside. I heard the soft crunch of debris under their hesitant steps, but no one spoke. The oppressive silence swallowed any attempt at conversation. The first room was a living area, or what was left of it. A torn couch sagged under its own weight, its stuffing spilling out like some grotesque display. A mirror hung crookedly on the far wall, cracked into a web of distorted reflections. My flashlight caught something smeared across its surface. Dark, uneven streaks that sent a chill racing down my spine. I stepped further in, the floor groaning beneath my weight. Each step felt like a betrayal, as though the house was warning me to leave. But I didn't. I couldn't. Something pulled me forward, an invisible thread that grew tighter with every movement. The kitchen was worse. The counters were gouged with deep, angry scratches, as though something had clawed at them in desperation. The sink was stained with streaks of reddish-brown that trailed down into the drain. And the truly curious stamped kigulf. Unwell. My stomach churned as I avoided looking too closely. And the air here was colder, biting at my skin, even though it was warm outside. I glanced over my shoulder to see if the others had followed. And they hadn't. Cowards, I muttered under my breath, though my voice felt hollow. The words hung in the air for a moment, before dissolving into silence. Then came the sound, a faint hum at first, like the vibration of power lines on a windy day. It grew louder as I moved down the hallway, morphing into something more organic, more alive. More alive. The shadows along the walls twisted unnaturally, stretching toward me like grasping fingers. My flashlight flickered once, then twice, before steadying. My breath hitched. At the end of the hall was a door. It was slightly ajar, and faint light spilled out, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. My instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place, and never return. But my feet moved on their own, dragging me closer. And where? Until Bhakti could fire. As I reached for the door, a sudden scream tore through the house. It wasn't human. The sound was jagged, raw, like an animal caught in a trap. My heart thundered in my chest as I froze, my hand hovering over the doorknob. The scream faded as quickly as it had come, leaving behind an even heavier silence. I pushed the door open. The room beyond defied logic. The walls bent and twisted at impossible angles, folding in on themselves like a broken accordion. At the center of the room was a single chair, illuminated by a weak, flickering bulb that hung from the ceiling. On the chair sat a figure, slumped forward, its head obscured by shadows. I stepped closer, each movement requiring every ounce of courage I could muster. The figure didn't move. The air grew thicker, choking, as though the room was drawing me in. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I directed it toward the figure. The light caught its face, and I froze. It was me. It was me. I staggered back, my heart hammering against my ribs. The figure's face was identical to mine, but lifeless. Its eyes staring blankly ahead, its expression frozen in anguish. Blood dripped steadily from its mouth, pooling beneath the chair. My legs locked, unable to run, unable to process what I was seeing. The room darkened, the bulb above flickering violently before extinguishing altogether. "Envelop," said the duel, "to Demi, school, die." Shadows enveloped me, and the humming returned, louder, more insistent. It was inside my head now, thrumming through my skull like a war drum. Everybody's fists. Then came the whisper, faint but clear. "It's not you." I turned, desperate to find the source. But the room was empty. The chair was gone. The figure, my figure, was nowhere to be seen. Only the sound remained, growing louder and more chaotic. It became a cacophony of voices, overlapping and indistinct, pulling me toward the center of the room. Something brushed against my shoulder. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Just the oppressive dark, and the sense that I was no longer alone. My breathing quickened as I stumbled back, tripping over something unseen. The whispers closed in, their words finally forming something coherent. "Leave now, or stay forever." I scrambled to my feet and ran. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, the door to the outside shrinking further and further away. The door slammed shut behind me with a force that rattled the cabin's frail frame. I turned instinctively, my hands fumbling for the knob, but it wouldn't budge. My flashlight beam flickered wildly across the walls, highlighting the warped patterns of decay. The whispers started again, softer this time, like they were coming from somewhere deep within the wood itself. The hallway loomed ahead, stretching into darkness. The air was heavier now, thick and oppressive, like the weight of 1,000 unseen eyes pressing down on me. My footsteps were hesitant, every creak of the floorboards beneath me, a reminder that I was somewhere I didn't belong. Each step forward felt like walking into quicksand, the sense of being pulled deeper into the cabin's grasp growing stronger. Ahead, a faint light seeped from beneath another door. It pulsed faintly, in rhythm with the whispers that echoed all around me. I didn't want to move closer, but my body betrayed me, drawn toward it as though on strings controlled by some unseen puppeteer. The closer I got, the louder the whispers became, shifting from a murmur into fragmented words. They were unintelligible, their meanings just out of reach, but they carried an unmistakable tone of warning. Or was it invitation? I reached the door and hesitated. The handle was ice cold beneath my fingers, sending a shiver up my arm. The light from beneath flickered, casting strange shadows that danced against my boots. My throat felt tight as I turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room beyond was vast, far too large to exist within the boundaries of the small cabin. Its walls were impossibly tall, rising into an inky void where no ceiling should be. In the center of the room stood a circle of chairs, each one facing inward, as if waiting for a meeting that would never start. On the floor between them was a symbol, etched in the wood, its sharp lines glowing faintly with a sickly green hue. The sight of it made my stomach churn, though I couldn't understand why. I stepped inside, the door closing softly behind me, as if sealing me in. The air was freezing now, every breath leaving a visible mist. The whispers stopped, abruptly, replaced by a deep rhythmic pounding that reverberated through the floor. It wasn't a sound I could identify. It was primal, ancient, something that made my teeth ache and my chest tighten. As I circled the chairs, my flashlight caught movement. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat as I swung the beam toward the source. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then I saw it clearly. A shadow detached itself from one of the chairs and moved across the room. It wasn't human. Its form was fragmented, shifting like smoke caught in a gust of wind. It didn't walk. It glided, silent and deliberate, its shape distorting with every movement. The pounding grew louder as the shadow stopped at the edge of the glowing symbol. It lingered there, its form writhing, and then it turned toward me. Though it had no face, I felt its gaze, a cold, piercing stare that made my skin crawl. My flashlight flickered again, the beam weakening, as though the light itself was being drained by its presence. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadow stretched toward me, its amorphous tendrils snaking across the floor. As they neared, the air grew even colder, the freezing sensation creeping up my legs like frostbite. My breath caught as one tendril reached my boot, brushing against it lightly. The sensation was electric, sending a jolt of icy pain shooting through my body. A voice boomed through the room, deep and resonant. Though it didn't come from the shadow, it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. You do not belong, it said, each word reverberating through my bones. The shadow recoiled slightly, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to grow larger, its form solidifying as the pounding intensified. My flashlight gave out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. The only light now came from the glowing symbol on the floor, its eerie hue casting strange patterns on the walls. The shadow loomed over me, and for a moment I thought it would engulf me entirely, but it stopped, retreating toward the circle of chairs, as though called back by an unseen force. The pounding ceased, replaced by a deafening silence. Envelop, my breath was ragged as I stood there, rooted in place. Slowly, the shadow dissolved into the air, leaving behind only the faint glow of the symbol and the oppressive weight of the room. The door behind me creaked open on its own, and I stumbled backward into the hallway, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever I had just encountered. The hallway had changed. It was longer now, its walls covered in strange swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe under the faint light of my newly revived flashlight. My legs carried me forward, though my mind screamed at me to turn back. The whispers had returned, louder and more coherent now, their fragmented words echoing in my ears. Keep going, no turning back. I couldn't tell if the voices were guiding me or taunting me, but I had no choice but to obey. Each step felt heavier than the last, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on me like a physical weight. I didn't know where I was going, or what awaited me at the end of the hall. But one thing was certain. I wasn't alone. The hallway seemed endless now, stretching far beyond the cabin's original dimensions. My flashlight barely pierced the darkness. The beam swallowed whole by the oppressive void ahead. The whispers were relentless, growing louder with each faltering step I took. Their tones were shifting, pleading, mocking, warning, all layered atop one another in a chaotic symphony that threatened to unravel my sanity. The walls pulsed faintly, as though alive, their surfaces rippling like water under my light. My feet felt heavy, my steps sluggish, as though the air itself had thickened around me. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, drowning out everything except the whispers. My flashlight flickered again, its beam dancing erratically before stabilizing. The sense of being watched was suffocating, and I resisted the urge to turn around. I didn't want to see what might be lurking behind me. Envelop. I'll read. A doorway appeared suddenly on my left, its frame crooked and splintered. The whispers surged, louder and more insistent, urging me toward it. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, the metal icy beneath my fingers. The moment I turned it, the whispers fell silent, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The door swung open on its own, revealing a room bathed in an eerie, greenish light. It was small and claustrophobic, the walls covered in strange looping symbols that glowed faintly. In the center of the room stood a table, its surface scarred and blackened, as though burned. Atop it rested an object, an old, leather-bound book, its cover etched with more of those swirling, incomprehensible symbols. The air was thick with the scent of charred wood and something metallic, like blood. I hesitated at the threshold, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But something compelled me forward, a pull I couldn't resist. As I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me, the sound echoing through the room like a gunshot. The hum grew louder, vibrating through the floor and up into my legs, and the symbols on the walls began to pulse in time with it. My hand reached out toward the book before I even realized what I was doing. The leather was rough under my fingertips, its texture sending a shiver through me. I opened it slowly, the pages crackling as though they hadn't been touched in centuries. The text inside was written in a language I didn't recognize, the letters twisting and writhing on the page as if alive. My eyes struggled to focus on them, but the longer I stared, the more they seemed to make sense. "Speak it," a voice whispered, clear and distinct, cutting through the oppressive hum. It wasn't like the other whispers. It was deliberate, commanding, and it came from within the room. I froze, my heart racing as I scanned the empty space. The voice repeated, louder this time. "Speak it. Set it free." My mouth went dry, and my fingers trembled as they traced the unfamiliar symbols on the page. The urge to read them aloud was overwhelming, as though the words were forcing themselves into my mind. I clenched my jaw, fighting the compulsion, but the voice grew insistent, its tone rising to a near shout. "Speak it. Now." Before I could stop myself, the words spilled from my lips, guttural and foreign, their sound reverberating through the room. The moment the final syllable left my mouth, the book snapped shut, the force of it nearly breaking my fingers. The symbols on the walls flared brightly, the green light searing my eyes before plunging the room into complete darkness. The hum stopped. The air was deathly still, and for a moment, all I could hear was the ragged sound of my breathing. Then came the scraping, a low, grating noise like metal against stone. It started faintly, somewhere beyond the walls, but it grew louder, closer, until it was right behind me. I spun around, my flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam illuminated nothing but empty space, yet the sound persisted, circling me like a predator stalking its prey. My chest tightened as I backed toward the door, my hand fumbling for the knob. It was our levers. It wouldn't turn. It wouldn't. The scraping stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath. Every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for whatever came next. When it happened, it was worse than I could have imagined. A hand, pale and gnarled, its fingers impossibly long, emerged from the darkness. It reached for me, moving with an unnatural speed, and I stumbled backward, falling to the floor. My flashlight rolled out of my hand, its beam casting wild shadows across the room. The hand hovered inches from my face before retreating, disappearing back into the void as quickly as it had appeared. The whispers returned, louder and more frenzied than before. The walls began to close in, the symbols on their surface writhing and twisting violently. The room was collapsing around me, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing second. I scrambled to my feet, grabbing my flashlight, and threw myself at the door. This time, it gave way, and I tumbled into the hallway beyond. The door slammed shut behind me, the sound reverberating through the endless corridor. My legs felt like jelly, but I forced myself to move, to put as much distance as I could between myself and that room. The whispers followed me, growing fainter with each step, but they never faded entirely. They were part of me now, etched into my mind like the symbols on the walls. As I moved deeper into the hallway, I realized something chilling. The corridor was no longer straight. It twisted and turned, its angles impossibly sharp, leading me deeper into the unknown. There was no going back. The cabin had me, and it wasn't letting go. Silv's era kifa gay. The hallway twisted and coiled, its jagged turns feeling deliberately hostile, like it was reshaping itself to trap me. My flashlight flickered again, the beam barely cutting through the oppressive darkness. Each step forward felt heavier, as if something unseen was dragging me down. The whispers returned, low and guttural, slithering through the air like venomous snakes. I stumbled upon a new door, its wood swollen and warped. It seemed to pulse faintly, as though it was alive, and the rusted doorknob glinted in my flashlight's erratic beam. My breath caught as I reached for it. The whispers surged, angry now, warning me, begging me to stop. But I couldn't. What? Something stronger than fear, something primal and insidious, pulled me forward. The door opened with a groan, revealing a cavernous space that should have been there. The room was impossibly vast, its walls lined with grotesque, writhing shapes that melted into one another like liquid shadows. The floor was uneven, littered with shards of glass that caught the faint glow emanating from a strange, suspended object in the center of the room. It was a mirror, but its surface wasn't reflective. Instead, it rippled like water, its glass impossibly dark. It hung in midair, tethered by chains that stretched into the darkness above. The whispers were louder here, their tones blending into a maddening cacophony. They seemed to emanate from the mirror, vibrating through the air and into my very bones. I inched closer, my flashlight trained on the mirror. My reflection didn't appear. Instead, I saw something else. A figure moved within the rippling surface, its outline blurry, but unmistakably human. It turned slowly, its head tilting as if sensing me. I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure stepped closer to the surface, and I realized, with a jolt of terror, that it was me, not a reflection, not a copy. It was me. The figure raised a hand, mirroring my trembling one. I didn't hide at all, but when I let my arm fall, it didn't follow. It pressed its hand against the inside of the mirror, and the glass rippled violently, distorting its features. Its face twisted into something unrecognizable, a grotesque mockery of my own, its eyes hollow and burning with an unnatural light. "Let me out," it whispered, its voice low and cracked, cutting through the chaos around me. The sound wasn't coming from the mirror. It was inside my head. I staggered back, my chest tightening. "Envelop, tranquil." The figure's hand slammed against the glass, and the entire room trembled. The chains creaked and groaned, straining as the mirror began to swing back and forth, its rippling surface distorting further. "Let me out," the voice demanded, louder this time, filling every corner of my mind. My flashlight slipped from my grasp, clattering to the ground and spinning wildly. The light cast erratic shadows on the walls, and the shapes that lined them began to move. They peeled themselves free from the walls, emerging as twisted, skeletal forms that dripped with black ichor. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, their limbs bending in ways that defied logic. They advanced toward me, their hollow eyes fixed on mine, their mouths gaping open in silent screams. Panic overtook me, and I lunged for my flashlight, the cold metal reassuring in my grip. I shone it at the creatures, but the light only seemed to anger them. Their movements quickened, their distorted forms closing in. The mirror shuddered violently, and the figure inside grinned, a wide, grotesque grin that split its face in two. I turned and ran, my heart pounding against my ribs. The creatures followed, their clawed feet scraping against the ground, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. The hallway stretched endlessly before me, its walls narrowing as if trying to crush me. I tripped and fell, the flashlight skidding out of reach. Darkness engulfed me. The whispers roared, a symphony of anguish and rage, as cold, bony hands gripped my arms and legs, dragging me back. I screamed, thrashing against them, but their strength was overwhelming. The mirror's glow appeared ahead, its light flickering as the chains began to snap. One by one, the figure inside pressed its face against the glass, its features contorting in ecstasy as it whispered, "It's your turn." The last thing I saw before everything went black was the glass shattering, the figure stepping out of the mirror and into the world. The darkness pressed against me like a suffocating blanket, and the cold claws pulling me backward were relentless. My throat burned as I screamed, but the sound seemed to be swallowed whole by the abyss around me. Every instinct screamed at me to fight, to claw my way free, but the hands held firm, their icy grip draining every ounce of strength I had left. Through the oppressive blackness, the mirror's shattered remains shimmered faintly, like dying embers of a fire. But the figure was no longer within. It stood before me now, an uncanny shadow of myself, its movements unnervingly fluid and deliberate. The grotesque grin stretched across its face made my stomach churn, and its hollow, glowing eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that pierced through every layer of my being. "You let me out," it hissed, the voice no longer confined to the recesses of my mind. It was here, real and undeniable, reverberating through the air and chilling me to the core. The figure tilted its head, its movements eerily mechanical, as if testing the limits of its new freedom. The hands holding me released all at once, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. The air tasted metallic, tainted by the stench of rot and despair. I scrambled backward, but the figure took a slow, deliberate step closer, its grin widening impossibly. "Don't you see?" it whispered, crouching down to my level. "Luai, you've opened the door. The world doesn't belong to you anymore." "Es." I tried to speak, to demand answers, but my voice betrayed me, caught in the vice grip of terror. It leaned closer, and I could feel the cold radiating from its form, a bitter chill that seemed to seep into my very bones. "You thought you were strong," it continued, its tone mocking yet laced with venom. "You thought you could uncover the truth and walk away unscathed. But this," it gestured around the cavernous space, the writhing shadows, the endless void. "This isn't something you survive. This is something you become." The words struck like a physical blow, and I could feel something deep inside me breaking apart. The figure reached out, its hand unnervingly similar to mine, but its touch was like frostbite, sharp, searing, and agonizingly cold. It pressed its palm against my chest, and I felt an unbearable pressure building, as if it was reaching into me, pulling at the very essence of who I was. "No," I gasped, finding my voice at last. I grabbed at its wrist, trying to pry it away, but its strength was inhuman, unyielding. The grin never faltered as it pressed harder, and a sharp, searing pain tore through me. Images flashed through my mind. Memories, fears, dreams, all unraveling, bleeding into the void. The room trembled violently, and the shadows writhed with renewed fervor. The broken shards of the mirror began to move, sliding across the floor as if drawn by an unseen force. They assembled themselves into a jagged circle around us, their edges glinting menacingly. The figure's grin faltered for the first time, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "You're resisting," it muttered, its voice low and dangerous. "How quaint." "Ah, shoo." Summoning every ounce of strength I had left, I pushed back, shoving the figure with all my might. It stumbled, its expression twisting into something unrecognizably furious. I staggered to my feet, my chest heaving as I fought to steady myself. The shards around us began to glow, their light intensifying, and the whispers that had haunted me since entering this nightmare reached a deafening crescendo. The figure lunged at me, its movements a blur. But as it crossed the circle of shards, a burst of light erupted, forcing it back with an unearthly scream. The force threw me off balance, and I fell to the ground, shielding my eyes from the blinding glow. When the light dimmed, the figure was gone, its absence leaving an eerie stillness in the air. The shards lay inert, their glow extinguished, but the oppressive darkness remained, thicker than ever. My legs trembled as I pushed myself upright, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, the only thing keeping me moving. I wasn't safe. Whatever I had released wasn't gone. It had only begun, and I was the one who had set it free. Ah, the silence that followed was worse than the chaos. Envelop, chaos. It pressed against me like a leaden weight, every inch of my surroundings steeped in a suffocating stillness that seemed to stretch on forever. My breaths came in shallow gasps as I turned in a slow circle, flashlight trembling in my grip. The room, if it could even be called that, seemed to shift subtly, its edges bleeding into the shadows like ink on wet paper. The shards of the mirror lay scattered at my feet, their once menacing glow extinguished, but I could feel their presence still, like tiny pinpricks against my skin. They weren't lifeless, not completely. Something lingered in them, an echo of the thing I had unleashed. I moved cautiously, every step a struggle against the unnatural pull of the room. Ah, the walls, or what passed for walls, pulsed faintly, their surfaces rippling as though they were alive. The faint whispering returned, softer now, but more insidious, curling around my ears like smoke. Then, faintly, I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. Footsteps. Not mine. Slow, deliberate, and far too close. I froze, my flashlight beam darting frantically across the shifting shadows. Anyway, the footsteps continued, growing louder, more purposeful. Whoever or whatever it was wasn't trying to hide. Who's there? My voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. But the question hung in the air like a challenge. No answer, just the footsteps, closer now, echoing in a way that didn't make sense in this endless void of a space. I backed away instinctively, the beam of my flashlight flickering as if it too was afraid. And then I saw it. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form grotesquely distorted, as though it had been stretched and warped by the room itself. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural, and its face, if it could be called a face, was a smudged blur of features, shifting and twisting in a nauseating mimicry of humanity. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. The figure tilted its head, the motion oddly deliberate, as though studying me. Then it began to move, each step a jarring, bone-snapping contortion as it closed the distance between us. Panic surged through me, drowning out any semblance of rational thought. I turned and ran, the flashlight bobbing wildly in my grasp, as the shadows twisted and writhed around me. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into a cacophony that clawed at my mind. I didn't know where I was going. There was no sense of direction in this place. But anywhere was better than here. The footsteps followed, faster now, the sharp slap of bare feet against the ground reverberating like gunshots. I could feel it gaining on me, the air around me growing colder with each step. My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest as I pushed myself to keep moving. Ahead, a faint glow appeared, a doorway, its edges shimmering like heat waves. It shouldn't have been there. Nothing about this place made sense, but I didn't care. It was a way out, or at least a way forward. I sprinted toward it, throwing myself through the threshold, just as the footsteps reached an ear-piercing crescendo. The door slammed shut behind me, and the noise stopped. Silence enveloped me once more, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. I collapsed to the ground, clutching my chest as I fought to steady myself. The room I had entered was different. A narrow corridor lined with flickering, buzzing fluorescent lights. The walls were stark white, their sterile surface cracked and peeling in places. I rose shakily to my feet, my body trembling with exhaustion. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, the oppressive hum of the lights filling the space. Something about it felt wrong. This wasn't an escape. It was a trap, another layer of whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. And then the lights began to flicker, the darkness between each pulse growing longer. A sound echoed down the corridor, a wet, dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. It came from behind me. I turned slowly, every muscle in my body tensing as the sound grew louder. At the far end of the corridor, a shape emerged, a mass of shadows that coalesced into something horrifyingly familiar. The figure from before, but now larger, its limbs stretching unnaturally to scrape against the walls. Its featureless face turned toward me, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze piercing through me. I didn't wait. I ran. The corridor stretching impossibly before me. The sound of dragging and scraping chasing me like a predator. The lights continued to flicker. And with each pulse, the figure seemed closer, its movements defying logic. I didn't dare look back again. The whispers returned, louder now, shouting in a language I couldn't understand. The corridor began to narrow, the walls closing in as if trying to crush me. I could feel the figure's presence right behind me, its cold breath brushing the back of my neck. Just as I thought I couldn't run any farther, I saw it. A gaping hole in the floor ahead, its edges glowing faintly. I didn't hesitate. I dove into the void, the darkness swallowing me whole. The last thing I heard was its laughter, deep, guttural, and filled with malice. The void consumed me, pulling me deeper into its suffocating abyss. The sensation was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Weightless and crushing at the same time, as though the darkness itself were alive, wrapping around me like a second skin. I couldn't tell if I was falling or floating. Time had no meaning here. Then, suddenly, I landed hard. The impact knocked the wind out of me. My body sprawled across a cold, wet surface. The darkness around me began to shift, rippling like disturbed water. My flashlight, miraculously still in my hand, flickered weakly, casting faint beams across the ground. It wasn't solid. It was flesh-like. The surface pulsed under my touch, as though it had veins pumping some unseen lifeblood. I forced myself to my feet, every muscle in my body protesting. The whispers were gone, but the silence that replaced them was worse, pressing against my ears like a deafening hum. My surroundings began to take form, the darkness pulling back to reveal towering walls of twisted sinew and bone, their grotesque patterns illuminated by an unnatural red glow that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. I wasn't alone. Shapes moved in the periphery of my vision, slipping in and out of the shadows like phantoms. They were indistinct at first, their forms flickering as though they didn't fully belong in this realm. But as I stood frozen, their shapes became clearer. Elongated limbs, heads cocked at unnatural angles, eyes that glowed faintly with malevolent intelligence. They surrounded me, their movements synchronized, predatory. I stumbled backward, nearly slipping on the slick surface beneath me. One of the figures stepped forward, its gait unnervingly fluid, and I finally saw its face, or what was left of it, a mess of exposed muscle and jagged teeth. Its expression a grotesque parody of a smile. It raised a hand, fingers impossibly long, and pointed directly at me. Then, the ground beneath me shifted, undulating violently. I lost my balance, falling to my knees, as the fleshy surface opened up, revealing a chasm of writhing tendrils below. The figures didn't move. They just watched, their glowing eyes fixated on me as the tendrils reached out, wrapping around my legs with a horrifying wetness. I screamed, clawing at the ground, but there was nothing solid to grip. The tendrils tightened, pulling me closer to the edge of the chasm. And the figures remained still, their silence more unnerving than if they had spoken. I kicked and thrashed, but the more I struggled, the tighter their grip became. "No," I whispered, my voice shaking. "This can't be real." But it was. The pain was real. The terror was real. Just as I was about to be pulled into the abyss, the ground shuddered violently. The tendrils recoiled, releasing me as the entire chamber quaked. The figures turned as one, their attention drawn to something behind them. "I'm the sea. Could Tonka there's something behind them." I followed their gaze, my heart plummeting. A massive form emerged from the shadows, dwarfing everything else in the chamber. It was a monstrous amalgamation of limbs and faces, its flesh a patchwork of writhing, screaming forms. Eyes opened and closed across its surface, each one filled with unimaginable suffering. Its presence was overwhelming, radiating a palpable aura of despair and dread. The figures that had surrounded me began to move, their previously synchronized movements now frantic and disjointed. They backed away from the creature, their glowing eyes wide, with something I hadn't thought possible: fear. The creature let out a guttural roar that shook the chamber, its many faces contorting in agony and rage. The figures scattered, their forms dissolving into the shadows, as though they were never there. The creature's eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, locked onto me. "Run, Doddy. Mule, Tilvidane, Turles." The thought wasn't mine, but it rang in my mind with undeniable clarity. I didn't question it. I turned and ran, my flashlight flickering wildly as I stumbled across the shifting ground. The creature roared again, the sound reverberating through the air like a physical force, driving me forward. The chamber began to collapse around me, the walls of sinew and bone crumbling into the chasm below. A faint light appeared in the distance, a doorway, impossibly out of place in this hellish landscape. It was the only way out. I pushed myself harder, the air growing thick with the stench of decay as the creature closed in. I could feel its presence behind me, the ground shaking with each step it took. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they would give out at any moment. But I didn't stop. The doorway grew closer, its light blinding against the darkness. I reached out, every ounce of my strength focused on escaping. The creature let out one final roar, and I felt its claws swipe inches from my back as I dove through the threshold. The light consumed me, and for a moment there was nothing. No sound, no pain, no fear, just an all-encompassing void. When I opened my eyes, I was back. The world around me was normal, too normal. I was lying on the floor of my apartment, the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of the city filtering through the silence. My flashlight lay beside me, It's being weak but steady. I sat up slowly, my body trembling. The events of the past hours, or however long it had been, felt like a distant nightmare. But the marks on my legs, the faint whispers still lingering in the back of my mind, told me it had been real. And then I saw it. On the wall opposite me, scrawled in a substance I didn't want to identify, were 3 words: "You brought it." The lights flickered, and the room grew cold.